The moment his knee touched the cold pavement, something inside Matthew Reed cracked in a way he didn't recognize, as if the life he had carefully planned was suddenly being rewritten by a child holding a frayed teddy bear in a quiet park. He hadn't meant to stop walking that afternoon, hadn't meant to look twice at the little boy standing alone on the path, hadn't meant to become part of a story he had spent years convincing himself he didn't want. Yet there he was, breath caught in his chest, staring at small hands clutching something broken, wondering without warning what he would do if he were the one standing there, small and unsure, waiting for someone who might never come. Matthew had told himself for a long time that relationships were a risk he couldn't afford. After his divorce 5 years earlier, after the nights spent staring at ceilings and wondering how love had slipped through his fingers so quietly, he built a life that asked nothing of anyone and offered little in return. He worked long hours as a construction manager in Ohio, lived alone in a narrow townhouse, and avoided invitations that hinted at permanence. Love, he believed, was a contract that eventually expired. Children were commitments that demanded more than he could give. He told himself he was fine this way, that solitude was safer than disappointment, that not wanting was easier than losing. That afternoon he had only come to the park to clear his head. The trees were shedding their leaves in tired spirals, the benches damp with autumn's slow retreat, the path quiet except for distant laughter and the creak of old swings. He noticed the woman first, seated on a bench with her hands folded tight in her lap, eyes distant in a way that suggested exhaustion rather than peace. Then he saw the boy, barely 3, curls catching the light, standing uncertainly between the man who had already turned away and the woman who hadn't yet risen. The child's shoe was untied. The bear in his arms had lost one button eye. Matthew hesitated, the way people always do when life asks them for something unexpected. What if this were you, standing here with a child who needed help, with a woman whose silence hid more than words ever could? Would you walk past and protect the boundaries you'd spent years building, or would you risk stepping into someone else's unfinished story? He knelt anyway, fingers steady as he tied the loose lace, eyes drawn to the boy's serious face and the way he watched every movement with quiet trust. The bear slipped, and Matthew caught it before it hit the ground, brushing dirt from its threadbare belly as though it were something precious. The woman rose slowly then, gratitude flickering across her tired features, and for a moment Matthew saw something fragile in her, something held together by effort alone. Her name, he would later learn, was Rachel Carter. She was 32, widowed by a drunk driver 2 winters earlier, raising her son Noah in a small apartment that smelled faintly of detergent and reheated soup. She had not planned to sit on that bench so long. Her legs had simply failed her after a night without sleep and a morning without answers. Noah's favorite toy had broken the day before, and she hadn't yet found the money to replace it. Matthew did not ask for their story, and Rachel did not offer it. They exchanged only a few polite words, the kind strangers use when they are careful not to reveal too much. But as Matthew stood to leave, Noah reached for him with surprising certainty, offering the bear as though it were a gift, as though this man who had tied a shoe and rescued a toy deserved something in return. The gesture lodged itself somewhere deep inside Matthew, where old regrets lived, and he walked away with a weight in his chest he couldn't explain. Days passed, then weeks, and he found himself returning to that park more often than necessary. He told himself it was habit, that the air cleared his head, that routine kept loneliness at bay. Yet each time he scanned the benches, hoping and dreading in equal measure. When he finally saw Rachel again, Noah toddling beside her, he felt a jolt of recognition that frightened him more than it comforted. This time they spoke longer, about weather and work and the stubbornness of old playground equipment. Rachel laughed once, softly, and the sound surprised them both. Matthew learned about Noah in fragments, about speech therapy appointments and nightmares that came without warning, about the way he cried for a father he barely remembered. He learned about Rachel's fear of trusting anyone again, about the bills that piled quietly on the kitchen counter, about the strength it took to keep moving when grief still waited in corners. And without meaning to, he began to stay. He pushed swings, fixed broken wheels on toy trucks, brought spare snacks in his coat pocket. He told himself he was only helping, only being kind, only passing time. But slowly, against his will, his life bent toward theirs. At night he lay awake asking himself questions he had avoided for years. What if this happened to you, he wondered, if a child looked at you the way Noah did, with unguarded hope and no understanding of risk? Would you protect yourself, or would you risk becoming someone important to someone else again? He remembered the marriage he had failed, the promises he had broken, the fear that he was simply not built for permanence. Yet each time Noah ran toward him in the park, arms open and smile unfiltered, that fear lost a little of its power. Change came quietly. Matthew bought a small set of building blocks and kept them in his car. He learned which stories calmed Noah before sleep, even though he was not there to read them at night. He fixed the loose hinge on Rachel's kitchen cabinet one afternoon when the landlord had not returned calls for weeks. He did not notice at first that he had stopped avoiding invitations, that he had started planning weekends, that his empty townhouse felt less like a refuge and more like a waiting room. Rachel watched him carefully, gratitude tangled with caution. She had learned how quickly life could steal what it gave, how love could become loss without warning. She did not ask Matthew for more than he offered, and he did not promise what he feared he could not keep. But sometimes, when Noah fell asleep on his shoulder during late afternoons, when Rachel's eyes softened at the sight, a fragile possibility hovered between them, unspoken but alive. The turning point arrived on a gray November morning when Noah slipped on wet leaves and split his lip. The blood startled everyone, the cry sharp and sudden, and Rachel froze for half a second too long, memories of hospitals and sirens flooding back. It was Matthew who lifted the boy, who pressed a clean handkerchief to the wound, who whispered steady words without thinking. At the clinic, as they waited for stitches, Noah clung to Matthew's coat with fierce determination, refusing to be handed back until the doctor called his name. In that sterile room, with fluorescent lights humming overhead, Matthew realized something he had been denying since the first loose shoelace. He was no longer standing on the edge of their lives. He tried to retreat after that, frightened by the depth of what he felt, by the future that suddenly loomed with terrifying clarity. He skipped the park for a week, ignored messages he pretended not to see, told himself this was the sensible choice. But the quiet in his townhouse became unbearable, every corner echoing with absence. When he finally returned, he found Rachel sitting alone, Noah tracing circles in the dirt with a stick, both of them thinner somehow, as though his absence had carved a small hollow they had not known how to fill. There were no grand confessions, no dramatic declarations. Only an understanding that formed slowly, built on small acts and shared silences. Matthew began attending Noah's therapy sessions, learned how to guide tiny hands through careful exercises, celebrated each new word as if it were a miracle. He helped Rachel fill out scholarship forms for a night class she had abandoned after her husband's death. He let himself imagine holidays that did not end in loneliness, futures that did not end in regret. The day Noah called him Dad by accident came without ceremony, a slip of a tired tongue after a long afternoon of puzzles and laughter. The word hung in the air like a fragile glass ornament, waiting to shatter. Matthew felt his breath leave him, felt the old fear surge, felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Rachel's eyes filled with tears she did not wipe away. Noah, unaware of the earthquake he had caused, only smiled and reached for his bear, now stitched and whole again. Matthew did not correct him. Years later, standing in a small church with sunlight filtering through stained glass, Matthew realized how wrong he had been about readiness. He had thought love required preparation, certainty, perfect timing. Instead, it had arrived in the form of a broken toy and a frightened child, asking only for patience and presence. He had not been ready for a relationship, not in the way he once defined it. But he had been ready, it turned out, to become someone a little boy could depend on, someone a grieving woman could trust, someone his own wounded heart could finally forgive. If you have ever walked past a moment that might have changed everything, if you have ever feared that you were too broken, too late, too unsure to begin again, what would you do if kindness asked for more than a passing glance? Before this story ends, I would love to know what you felt reading it, what memories or hopes it stirred in you, and what choices you might have made differently. And if this story touched your heart even a little, please like it, share it with someone who might need it, leave a comment, and subscribe, because sometimes the smallest stories carry the greatest second chances.